Captain Jake Morrison was having what he generously called a Tuesday when the alien delegation decided to grace his humble cargo hauler with their presence. The Spice Runner wasn't much to look at, honestly. She was a beat-up freighter that smelled permanently of garlic and motor oil, hauling food supplies between human colonies. Not exactly the kind of ship you'd expect to host what the Galactic Council pompously called a cultural culinary assessment mission. But there they were, materializing on his bridge in a shower of pretentious sparkles, led by Ambassador Quillix of the Zephyrian Empire. Quillix looked like someone had crossed a peacock with a lawyer and then taught it to sneer professionally. His feathers shimmered with an oily iridescence that probably cost more than Jake's entire ship, and he held himself with the kind of rigid posture that screamed, "I have 17 advanced degrees and I'm going to make that your problem." "Greetings, primitive human," Quillix announced, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining quantum physics to houseplants. "I am Ambassador Quallok, and this is Chef Vorthak of the Culinary Institute of Proxima Sublime." Chef Vorthak looked like a giant lobster who'd gotten really into bodybuilding and even more into being an absolute nightmare to work with. His forearms gestured dismissively at everything they touched, and his compound eyes held the special kind of contempt that only comes from years of telling people their taste buds are wrong. "We have come," Vorthak chittered in a voice like nails on a chalkboard, having an argument, "to sample what your species laughingly calls cuisine. We understand it consists primarily of charred animal flesh and fermented plant matter, prepared with all the sophistication of a thermal detonator." Jake glanced at his crew, who were doing their best not to laugh. His navigator, Torres, was practically biting his tongue, while his engineer, Kumar, had developed a sudden fascination with his boots. The only one who looked genuinely excited was Pip, his junior chef. But then again, Pip got excited about expired ration packs if you seasoned them right. "Well," Jake said slowly, adopting the kind of patient tone he usually reserved for explaining why you shouldn't lick the ion drive, "I suppose we could rustle up some of our worst offerings for your expert evaluation." Quillix's feathers practically vibrated with satisfaction. "Excellent. We shall document the primitive nature of human gastronomy for the Galactic Archives. Perhaps we can recommend some basic improvements to elevate your species beyond subsistence-level food preparation." "Oh, we'd be honored," Jake replied, his sarcasm so thick you could serve it with crackers. "Pip, why don't you show our distinguished guests to the mess hall? I'm sure they're just dying to experience authentic human cooking." As the delegation swept out of the bridge like a parade of culinary superiority, Jake caught Pip's eye. The kid was grinning like she'd just won the lottery and found a $20 bill in the same day. This was going to be interesting. The mess hall of the Spice Runner had seen better days, which was saying something since its better days had occurred sometime during the previous century. The fluorescent lights flickered with the enthusiasm of a dying firefly, and the tables bore the kind of stains that told stories nobody really wanted to hear. But Pip had managed to transform one corner into something resembling a dining area, complete with actual plates that weren't made of recycled hull plating. The alien delegation arranged themselves around the table like judges at a war crimes tribunal. Besides Quillix and Vortak, there was Fizzle, a nervous little translator who looked like a cross between a ferret and a panic attack, and 3 other food critics whose names Jake hadn't bothered to remember, but who all shared the same expression of terminal boredom mixed with professional superiority. "Now then," Quillix announced, adjusting what Jake assumed were the alien equivalent of reading glasses, "present us with your most representative culinary disasters so that we may properly catalog the extent of human gastronomic failure." Pip emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray that held what any reasonable person would call a pretty decent spread. Pizza slices that actually looked like pizza, burgers that hadn't achieved sentience, and tacos that were holding together better than most of Jake's relationships. Vorthak examined the pizza slice with the kind of intense scrutiny usually reserved for bomb disposal. "This appears to be bread covered in coagulated dairy proteins and processed meat circles. How charmingly primitive." He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then immediately reached for another slice while maintaining his expression of disgust. "Yes, just as barbaric as expected." Quillix picked up a burger with 2 of his delicate feathered appendages, holding it like it might explode. The construction is crude, clearly the work of a species that hasn't discovered proper layering techniques. He bit into it, his eyes widening slightly before he quickly composed himself. "Though I suppose for a barely civilized race, the flavor combination isn't entirely offensive to the palate." Jake noticed that both critics were steadily working their way through their portions while delivering increasingly elaborate insults. Vorthak had moved on to his second taco, proclaiming it an unfortunate fusion of textures that somehow manages to avoid complete culinary catastrophe, while Quillex was eyeing the remaining burger pieces with what could only be described as longing, disguised as anthropological interest. Fizzle, the translator, had abandoned all pretense and was simply inhaling a slice of pizza while making small, happy, squeaking noises. When he noticed Jake watching, he immediately straightened up and squeaked, "I am merely analyzing the molecular structure for accurate translation purposes." "Of course you are," Jake said, watching the little alien grab another slice. The other critics were engaged in what appeared to be competitive eating disguised as professional analysis. One of them, a blue-scaled creature that looked like an iguana with a philosophy degree, was methodically demolishing a burger while explaining to anyone who would listen that the crude simplicity of the preparation actually highlighted the inherent flaws in human taste development. "Pip," Jake called to his chef, who was watching the proceedings with barely contained glee, "I think our guests are ready for the next course." Pip's grin could have powered a small space station. "Oh, I think they're going to love what I've prepared next." Pip disappeared into the kitchen with the enthusiasm of someone about to commit a beautiful crime. Jake could hear clattering, sizzling, and what sounded suspiciously like maniacal giggling coming from behind the service window. The alien critics, meanwhile, were still working on their analysis of the first course, which apparently required eating every last crumb while maintaining expressions of profound disappointment. "The textural inconsistencies are fascinating from an anthropological perspective," Quillex was saying, reaching for what Jake was pretty sure was his fourth slice of pizza. "It's almost as if your species actively seeks to create chaos in the mouth." "Exactly," Vorthak agreed, nodding sagely while polishing off his third taco. "No understanding of proper flavor harmony whatsoever. It's almost primitive enough to be charming, in the way that watching small children attempt to paint can be amusing." That's when the aroma hit them. Jake watched with considerable entertainment as the entire alien delegation suddenly went very, very still. It was like someone had hit a pause button on a particularly pretentious dinner party. Quillex's elegant neck craned toward the kitchen like a flower following the sun, and Vorthak's compound eyes actually dilated. "What?" Fiesel whispered in a voice that had gone up about 3 octaves. "Is that magnificent smell?" Pip emerged from the kitchen carrying a platter that could only be described as humanity's greatest achievement. The bacon-wrapped jalapeno mac and cheese sliders were arranged with the kind of casual perfection that suggested she'd been planning this moment for her entire career. The bacon glistened, the cheese bubbled invitingly, and the jalapenos provided just enough green to make the whole thing look almost healthy if you squinted and had recently suffered a head injury. "Oh, this old thing," Pip said with the false modesty of someone who knew they were about to change the course of galactic history. "Just something I threw together from our leftover ingredients. Nothing fancy, just bacon-wrapped, jalapeno mac and cheese sliders with a garlic aioli and a hint of smoked paprika." The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for religious experiences or natural disasters. Jake was pretty sure he could actually see Vorthak's resolve crumbling in real time. "I suppose," Quillex said in a voice that had gone notably hoarse, "we should sample this creation for the sake of thorough documentation." "Purely for scientific purposes," Vorthak added, but his forearms were already reaching for the platter with the desperate hunger of someone who had just discovered they'd been living their entire life wrong. Quillex picked up one of the sliders with trembling feathers, holding it like it was either going to save his soul or damn it forever. He took a small, careful bite, chewed thoughtfully, and then his eyes rolled back in his head with an expression that Jake was pretty sure was illegal in at least 3 star systems. "This is," Quillex began, then stopped, took another bite, and made a sound that no dignified ambassador should ever make in public. "This is absolutely, the preparation is still quite crude, but there's a certain, that is to say..." Vorthak had abandoned all pretense and was simply making small, desperate, whimpering noises while devouring his slider with the intensity of someone who had found religion at the bottom of a bacon-wrapped miracle. The other critics weren't faring much better. The blue-scaled philosopher had given up on forming coherent sentences entirely and was just pointing at his slider while making appreciative clicking sounds. Fizzle was curled up in his chair, clutching his food and rocking gently back and forth. "So," Jake said conversationally, "still think human cuisine needs improvement?" Quillex tried to glare at him, but it's hard to look dignified when you're covered in cheese sauce and making involuntary pleasure sounds. What happened next would later be recorded in the galactic archives under diplomatic incidents that really got out of hand. It started innocently enough when Quillex, in a moment of weakness disguised as scholarly interest, reached for a second slider. That's when Vorthak's compound eyes locked onto the same piece of bacon-wrapped perfection with the intensity of a targeting computer. "I believe," Vorthak said in a voice that had gone dangerously quiet, "that particular specimen requires further analysis by someone with actual culinary training." Quillex's feathers ruffled with indignation. "I am conducting a thorough diplomatic assessment of this admittedly acceptable food item. Stand down, chef." "Stand down?" Vorthak's voice cracked like a whip made of pure outrage and cheese withdrawal. "I am a graduate of the Culinary Institute of Proxima Sublime. I have 17 certifications in advanced flavor profiling. I will not stand down from a piece of primitive human food preparation." That's when things got interesting. Quillex made a grab for the slider with one elegant feathered appendage, while Vorthak deployed all 4 of his arms in what could only be described as a coordinated pincer movement. The collision was spectacular. Quillex's dignity evaporated as he squawked and flapped, trying to maintain his grip on the slider while Vorthak chittered something that Jake was pretty sure translated to mine, 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 in at least 4 different languages. The 2 of them went down in a tangle of feathers, shell, and what remained of their professional reputations. They rolled across the mess hall floor, locked in mortal combat over 6 ounces of bacon-wrapped heaven, while making sounds that would have embarrassed their respective species for generations. "Gentlemen," Jake said mildly, but he might as well have been talking to a couple of hurricanes having a disagreement. That's when Fizzle, apparently deciding that if you can't beat them, you should join them, and grab whatever food you can in the process, launched himself at the platter with a war cry that sounded like a rusty gate being murdered. The little translator landed directly in the remaining sliders, sending bacon and cheese flying in all directions like the world's most delicious shrapnel. The blue-scaled philosopher, who had been trying to maintain some semblance of academic detachment, took one look at the food flying through the air and apparently decided that his advanced degrees in xenocultural studies didn't prepare him for this level of temptation. He dove under the table, emerged with a slider clutched in his claws, and began defending it from all comers, with the ferocity of someone protecting their young. The other 2 critics, whose names Jake still couldn't remember but who were rapidly becoming memorable for entirely the wrong reasons, had formed an impromptu alliance and were attempting to corner what appeared to be the last intact slider. They moved with the careful coordination of hunters stalking dangerous prey, except the dangerous prey was a piece of food and they were supposedly sophisticated members of galactic high society. "This is for scientific purposes," one of them kept repeating like a mantra while wrestling with his colleague over possession of the prize. "Purely anthropological research," the other agreed, trying to bite his partner's hand. Jake watched the mayhem unfold with the kind of detached fascination usually reserved for nature documentaries about particularly violent ecosystems. The mess hall had become a war zone of flying cheese, desperate aliens, and what he was pretty sure were the death throes of interstellar diplomacy as they knew it. The chaos reached its peak when the ship's security drones, apparently deciding that the noise level had exceeded acceptable parameters, descended from their ceiling compartments to restore order. Unfortunately, nobody had programmed them to deal with airborne bacon grease. The first drone made it approximately 3 feet before its sensors became so clogged with cheese that it began spinning in confused circles, emitting distressed beeping sounds. The second drone fared even worse, flying directly into a piece of flying jalapeno and immediately crashing into the wall where it continued to spark and occasionally mutter, "Threat assessment inconclusive," in a voice that suggested it was having some kind of mechanical nervous breakdown. Through it all, Pip stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and a smile that could have lit up a small moon. "I think," she said to Jake over the sounds of dignified aliens behaving like caffeinated squirrels, "they like it." The silence that followed the great slider war of the mess hall was the kind that usually comes after explosions or particularly awkward family dinners. The alien delegation slowly untangled themselves from what could generously be called a diplomatic incident, and less generously be called a complete breakdown of interstellar decorum. Ambassador Quillex was the first to attempt damage control, which was impressive considering he was covered head to toe in mac and cheese, had bacon grease in his feathers, and there was a piece of jalapeno stuck to his forehead like the world's most delicious scarlet letter. He straightened his posture with the kind of dignity that only comes from years of practice, pretending embarrassing things didn't just happen in front of witnesses. "Ahem," he began, his voice carrying all the authority of someone trying very hard to pretend they hadn't just been rolling around on the floor fighting over food like a particularly sophisticated raccoon. That was, of course, a necessary demonstration of human food safety protocols. We needed to ensure that your cuisine wouldn't cause any adverse reactions among civilized species. Jake raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling it? Absolutely, Quillix continued, plucking the jalapeno from his forehead with as much grace as one can muster while removing vegetables from one's face. A thorough, hands-on investigation into the potential hazards of human food preparation. The fact that we all survived this ordeal is a testament to your species' unexpected competency in basic nutrition. Chef Vorthak, who was busy trying to extract cheese from between his shell plates while maintaining what remained of his professional dignity, nodded vigorously. Indeed, the research required extensive sampling to ensure accurate data collection. Multiple samples, many samples. His compound eyes darted toward the empty platter with what could only be described as longing disguised as scientific interest. For posterity, you understand. Of course, Jake said, his tone so dry it could have been used to preserve meat. Very thorough research. Fizzle, the translator, had given up all pretense and was openly licking cheese sauce off his fingers while making small, happy chirping sounds. When he noticed everyone looking at him, he immediately straightened up and squeaked, "I was merely analyzing the molecular composition through advanced gustatory sensors. Standard protocol." Right, Jake nodded solemnly. Standard protocol. The blue-scaled philosopher, who had somehow managed to maintain possession of a single slider throughout the entire chaos, was now holding it protectively against his chest like a mother protecting her young. The flavor profile, he announced, with the kind of academic authority that comes from years of overthinking simple concepts, demonstrates unexpected complexity for such a primitive preparation method. The interplay between the umami compounds in the bacon, the capsaicin heat delivery system of the jalapenos, and the calcium-based protein matrix of the cheese creates a surprisingly sophisticated sensory experience. So you liked it, Jake translated. I found it not entirely offensive to sophisticated palates, the philosopher admitted, then immediately took another bite and made a small sound of contentment that rather undermined his scholarly objectivity. Vortak cleared his throat, which in his case sounded like a garbage disposal having philosophical doubts. In the interest of complete scientific documentation, we would require detailed analysis of your preparation methods. Recipes, if you will. Purely for academic purposes, you understand. Academic purposes, Jake repeated. Absolutely. The Culinary Institute of Proxima Sublime maintains extensive archives of primitive cooking techniques. This would be invaluable for our anthropological studies. Vorthak paused, then added with the casual desperation of someone trying very hard to sound casual. We might need multiple samples, for comparison studies. Perhaps weekly deliveries, for science. Quillix nodded so enthusiastically that more cheese fell from his feathers. The Galactic Council would be very interested in establishing regular cultural exchange programs, food sampling programs, diplomatic tasting initiatives. We could arrange very favorable trade agreements in exchange for continued access to, continued research opportunities. Jake looked at his crew, who were all grinning like they'd just won the galactic lottery. Torres was making notes on his tablet, probably calculating trade route profits. Kumar was already sketching modifications to the ship's kitchen facilities, and Pip looked like someone had just told her she was being promoted to Supreme Overlord of Culinary Conquest. Well, Jake said slowly, savoring the moment like a fine wine or a particularly satisfying revenge. I suppose we could work something out. After all, in the spirit of interspecies cooperation and scientific advancement. Excellent, Quillix breathed, his relief so palpable you could have served it as a side dish. Perhaps we could discuss terms over another round of research samples? I think that could be arranged, Jake replied, watching as the most sophisticated food critics in the known galaxy practically vibrated with anticipation at the prospect of more human cuisine. For science, of course. Of course, they all chorused, with about as much convincing conviction as a group of kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar claiming they were just checking if the cookies were still fresh. 6 months later, Jake stood on the observation deck of the newly christened Spice Runner 2, watching a line of alien vessels that stretched from here to next Tuesday, all waiting patiently for their turn at what had become the galaxy's first and most successful interstellar food truck operation. The irony wasn't lost on him that humanity's first major diplomatic victory had come not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through the simple art of wrapping things in bacon and adding just the right amount of cheese. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. What started as a small cargo hauler had evolved into a mobile culinary empire that employed half the human colonies and had waiting lists longer than most civilizations' recorded histories. Pip, now bearing the official title of Chief Culinary Ambassador to the Galaxy, along with a salary that could buy small planets, had become something of a legend among the various alien species. There were rumors that several governments had tried to recruit her, offering everything from royal positions to entire star systems, but she'd turned them all down with the simple explanation that this is too much fun to quit. The regular customers had become a source of endless entertainment. Ambassador Quillick still showed up every Tuesday, maintaining his pretense that these visits were part of an ongoing cultural assessment program, while ordering what Jake was pretty sure was enough food to feed a small army. He'd developed particular expertise in human comfort foods and could now discuss the finer points of grilled cheese sandwich construction with the passion of a tenured professor explaining quantum mechanics. Chef Vorthak had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. The pompous culinary snob had become something resembling a groupie, hanging around the kitchen and pestering Pick for cooking tips with the enthusiasm of a culinary school dropout who'd just discovered their calling. He'd even started incorporating primitive human techniques into his own cooking, though he still refused to admit that bacon made everything better. His weekly orders had grown so large that Jake suspected he was either feeding half of Proxima Sublime or had developed the kind of addiction that would require professional intervention. Fizzle had given up all pretense entirely and had actually requested a transfer to become the official liaison between the Galactic Council and what they now diplomatically referred to as Human Culinary Research Initiatives. His job description officially involved cultural translation services, but mostly he just hung around the kitchen making happy squeaking noises and taste-testing everything Pip made. Jake was pretty sure Fizzle had gained about 30 pounds since their first meeting, but the little alien seemed happier than a translator had any right to be. Even the blue-scaled philosopher had abandoned his academic pretensions, publishing a series of papers with titles like The Socio-Economic Impact of Bacon, A Cross-Species Analysis, and Cheese as a Diplomatic Tool, Rethinking Interstellar Relations Through Dairy-Based Initiatives. His work had become required reading at several universities, and Jake had heard rumors that there were entire graduate programs being developed around what scholars were calling human culinary anthropology. The success had created its own challenges, of course. They'd had to expand their operation 3 times just to keep up with demand, and Jake now employed a fleet of ships that could feed entire planets on short notice. The Galactic Council had officially recognized human cuisine as a strategic cultural asset, which Jake was pretty sure was bureaucrat speak for "we're all addicted and please don't stop making the food, or we might have to declare war on someone out of withdrawal-induced rage." The most satisfying part, though, was watching the gradual shift in how humans were perceived across the galaxy. Where once they'd been dismissed as a primitive species, barely worth acknowledging, they were now courted by civilizations that had previously considered humanity somewhere between amusing and irrelevant. Trade agreements that had taken decades to negotiate were now being settled over lunch meetings featuring Pip's latest creations. Diplomatic disputes that had simmered for centuries were being resolved through what the media had dubbed culinary diplomacy. Jake's personal favorite was the peace treaty between the Andromedans and the Centauri Federation, which had been successfully negotiated during a barbecue competition that Pip had organized. Apparently nothing brings warring species together quite like arguing over the proper way to smoke a brisket, while simultaneously admitting that both sides had been idiots for fighting over a few asteroids when they could have been sharing recipes instead. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by the human government either. Jake had received enough medals and commendations to open his own military surplus store, and Pip had been offered positions in everything from the diplomatic corps to the Department of Interstellar Commerce. But they'd both turned down the official recognition in favor of something far more satisfying: the knowledge that they'd accidentally conquered most of the known galaxy through the simple expedient of making really, really good food. As Jake watched another alien delegation board the ship, their official robes and dignified bearing fooling absolutely no one about why they were really there, he couldn't help but smile. Humanity had spent centuries wondering how they'd make their mark on the galaxy, imagining grand battles and technological breakthroughs that would establish their place among the stars. Turns out, all they'd needed was bacon, cheese, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that no matter how sophisticated a civilization thinks it is, everyone's got a weakness for comfort food, wrapped in bacon and served with a side of perfectly melted cheese. The universe, Jake reflected, had a wonderful sense of humor and an excellent appetite.